Hello everyone, we're Lincy and Jennifer, and today we're going to talk about why does macroeconomic theory not fix supply shock recessions very well. Our thesis is that fiscal and monetary policy do not fix supply shocks well because output is determined by factors of production and not by monetary variables. Each variable in the output equation, consumer spending, investment, government spending, and net export, is tied with the interest rates. Therefore, when monetary or fiscal policy are used, interest rates are affected, decreasing the effectiveness of the policy. Additionally, supply shocks cause a simultaneous fall in aggregate output and rise in aggregate price level. Monetary and fiscal policy cannot fix one issue without exacerbating the other.
So, what are supply shocks? A supply shock is an unexpected event that changes the supply of a product, which results in a sudden change in its price. Most supply shocks are negative, which means supply is decreased. Supply shocks can also be positive and increase supply. Assuming aggregate demand is unchanged, a negative supply shock in a product or a commodity causes its price to rapidly increase, while a positive supply shock causes its price to suddenly drop. The graph on the left shows a negative supply shock, with the aggregate supply curve shifting to the left.
In the short run, negative supply shock causes the aggregate supply curve to shift to the left, decreasing the real GDP, increasing price level, and creating stagflation and a recessionary gap. In the long run, the economy will self-correct and recover itself. In a recessionary gap, since there is a high unemployment, wages and resource prices will eventually go down. This means costs will decrease and AS curve will shift to the right, bringing the economy back to the equilibrium.
Macroeconomics was created for only two reasons: to measure the overall economy and to fix it if there's a problem. When it comes to measuring the economy, there's only three possible things that could be happening at any given period of time. The economy can be in a recession, it can be at full employment, or it can have an inflationary gap. Now let's analyze how to fix the problem. Let's start with a recession. If there is a recession, we have only three different options we can use. We can do no policy at all, which is just to wait it out. We can use fiscal policy, or we can use monetary policy. What you need to know is how do these things affect the overall economy and what happens on the graph. For example, if we take no policy action at all in a recession, what's going to happen to aggregate supply? Well, since we have high unemployment, eventually wages are going to go down and resource prices will go down, which means costs will go down and aggregate supply will shift to the right. This will put us back at full employment. So remember, the economy is self-correcting over time. So if we do nothing, eventually we'll go back to full employment, the long-run aggregate supply. Now what about fiscal policy? There are only two tools in the toolbox of fiscal policy. They are government spending and taxation. So if there's a recession, what do we do to government spending, or what can we do to taxes in order to stimulate the economy and get us out of the recession? Well, we can increase government spending or we can cut taxes. But wait, taxes aren't a shifter of aggregate demand. Well, lowering taxes would increase consumer spending, which would shift aggregate demand to the right. The third option we can use is monetary policy. This is controlling the money supply to affect interest rates and shift aggregate demand. So when we're in a recession, we want to increase the money supply. This will decrease interest rates and increase investment in consumption. That'll increase aggregate demand and close a recessionary gap. But what causes an increase in the money supply? I know that we need to increase the money supply, but how do we do it? Well, there's three tools in the toolbox of monetary policy. They are the reserve requirement, the discount rate, and open market operations. So what could the Fed do to each one of these things to get us out of a recession? Well, they can lower the reserve requirement, which means banks can create more money. They can lower the discount rate, which means they can loan out more money to banks, or they can buy bonds. When the Fed buys bonds, it puts money in the system, increasing the money supply. So for the bottom two, aggregate demand is increasing. We're speeding up the economy using some sort of government intervention. And the top one, we're just waiting it out and letting aggregate supply increase, putting us back in full employment.
Even though economy is self-correcting, the government will attempt to fix the problems using fiscal and monetary policies due to the lengthy time periods it takes for the economy to recover itself. However, there are many problems with using these macroeconomic policies. During a supply shock recession, two bad things are happening at the same time: a fall in aggregate output and a rise in the aggregate price level. Any policy that shifts the aggregate demand curve helps one problem only by making the other worse. If the government acts to increase aggregate demand and limit the rise in unemployment, it reduces the decline in output but causes even more inflation. If it acts to reduce aggregate demand, it curbs inflation but causes a further rise in unemployment. So this is a trade-off with no correct macroeconomic response. Besides the problems with the trade-off between inflation and unemployment, there are many other specific issues with macroeconomic policies that prevent supply shock recessions from being fixed. First, we're going to talk about fiscal policies, which include government spending and taxing.
First off, time lags are a huge issue. It takes some time for policymakers to realize that a recessionary or inflationary gap exists. This is called a recognition lag. Recognition lags are typically caused by the difficulties of collecting economic data in a timely and accurate manner. More time passes before a fiscal policy, such as a change in government spending or taxes, is agreed to and put into effect. This is called an implementation lag. And finally, even more time goes by before the policy has its full effect on aggregate supply. This is called an impact lag.
Crowding out effect. So what exactly is crowding out effect? It happens when government spending might cause unintended effects that weakens the impact of the policy, where interest rates rises and investments falls. The total level of output is fixed by the factors of production, thus causing there necessarily to be an equal but opposite change from an increase in government purchases. Because investment is more sensitive to interest rates than either consumption or net exports, investment takes the primary hit from fiscal policy change. For this reason, crowding out always occurs when expansionary fiscal policy is used. In the long run, this crowding out may hamper economic growth since investment affects the factors of production, which do affect total output. When taxes decrease, consumption immediately rises because disposable income rises. But since total output is fixed by the factors of production and government spending is fixed by fiscal policy, a change in consumption is met by an equal but opposite change in investment. Here again, the case exists where a change in fiscal policy crowds out investment. In this way, a trade-off is created between the short-run and long-run effects of fiscal policy upon the economy due to government spending and taxes replacing private investment. An example of the crowding out effect would be the Great Recession that took place during late 2000s, when massive spending on the part of the federal government on bonds and other securities actually had the effect of reducing interest rates, which causes failure in fixing the recession.
Next is the ratchet effect. Since escalations tend to self-perpetuate, once productive capacities have been added or prices have been raised, it's difficult to reverse these changes. People tend to be influenced by the previous best or highest level of production. For example, workers rarely accept their wages to be decreased. Some dangers of this are that people may become accustomed to constant growth even in markets that may be saturated. Therefore, the market may no longer satisfy consumer wants and needs, which defeats the overarching purpose of economics.
The net export effect is the idea that the impact of a change in fiscal policy will be strengthened or weakened by the resulting change in net exports. The change in net exports occurs due to the changes in real interest rates, which affect exchange rates among countries.
There are also problems with monetary policies, which involve management of money supply and interest rates. Similar to fiscal policy, monetary policy also has issues with time lags and the net export effects. Additionally, monetary policy is problematic due to political pressure. Elected officials might want the government to increase the money supply or cut the interest rate so that they increase their chances of getting elected. Political pressure may worsen the economy depending on if there is a recessionary or inflationary gap.
Another problem with the monetary policy would be that it might not apply to all countries. For example, Australia has a two-speed economy, meaning different sectors moving at a very different rates. A monetary policy cannot be used to treat any specific sectors since it affects the overall interest rates.
An example of how macroeconomics policy failed to fix the supply shock recession was the 1970s recession. The stagflation in the 1970s was due to a rapid increase in the price of oil, which is a negative supply shock. This caused prices to increase while economic growth slowed, making production less profitable. The stagflation continued as central banks used excessive monetary policy to counteract the resulting recession, growing the money supply too quickly. The effect of the monetary policy was the price/wage spiral, a cycle in which wage increases, causing price to increase, which in turn causes wage to increase, and so on.